Our next speaker, our last speaker for today is Ian Stephenson. Ian has been the University Curator at the University of New England in Armidale in North Regional New South Wales since 2010. He's also an Attingham alumnus, attending the 1995 Summer School, Royal Collections in 1999, and just this year, the Study Week in New York. From 2001 to 2005, Ian was Director of Historic Places in Canberra, where he was responsible for the management and interpretation of properties such as Lanyon Homestead at the foot of the Brindabella Ranges, Cawthorpe's House in Red Hill as well. For 11 years, he worked for the National Trust of Australia, New South Wales, and prior to his current appointment, Ian was CEO of National Trust in South Australia. He has a broad and diverse role as an historian and curator with a focus on historic collections and their interpretation through social history. Ian has curated many exhibitions, lectured on historic houses and their collections, and published numerous articles on architectural history. His current particular interest is Anglo-Indian architecture. Ian is also a trustee on the Copland Foundation and on the board of a trustee on the board of the National Trust of New South Wales.
Not dead, but only sleeping. As the last speaker, I hope that's not going to refer to my audience. New life for community house museums. Those who live in New South Wales would have been perturbed to read in the Sydney Morning Herald last year, lights go out at historic houses. The National Trust is considering mothballing a third or more of its historic properties because it can no longer afford to keep them open to the public. As a board member of the New South Wales Trust, I must say this was news to the board. So you can't believe everything you read in the paper. But it was and is indicative of challenges facing our sector. And I'm briefly going to look at some simple solutions to try and rectify those problems with visitor numbers and revenue. I believe the earliest I'm aware of, house museum in Australia was Government House, Sydney, which in 1912, when the newly elected New South Wales Labor government evicted the Governor-General was then in residence at Government House, Sydney and Government House, Melbourne. This is prior to the creation of Yarralumla, which we heard about earlier. The Governor-General was evicted and the house was turned into a museum of antiquities. And you can see that eviction is good for your visitor numbers, with all these people pouring into the house in the rain. This was followed by other house museums. Vaucluse House in the 1920s, in Tally House in Tasmania in the 1940s, both of which were government-run enterprises. The great age of our community-based historic houses started in the late 1950s with Como in Melbourne, 1959, and that led to the creation of the National Trust network of historic houses. I'm not sure how many of them there are. I noticed from the newly launched integrated National Trust national website, it says the Trust has over 280 properties. So I suppose it must have something approaching 100 historic houses. This is Franklin House near Launceston, early 1960s, and Experiment Farm Cottage, opened by the New South Wales National Trust in 1963. But within that portfolio, there are many other properties, and I want to just briefly mention a couple of South Australian ones. South Australia is blessed with deliciously idiosyncratic house museums which deserve to be better known. This one is a lighthouse at Kingston, SE, and it originally was placed on a reef. The lighthouse, it's a prefabricated lighthouse made in England and shipped to South Australia in the 1870s and erected on a reef. And it included a house, which you can see there, which was designed to house 3 families because you needed to have 3 lighthouse keepers to keep the light going. And so there were 3 families living in this wonderful, sort of like Monsieur Hulot. The Kingston branch of the National Trust, a very small branch, enthusiastically operate this museum. Another one is the Davis House at Keith. Keith is a very small town near the South Australian-Victorian border. And this beguiling rustic property is extremely well managed by the Keith National Trust branch, which consists of 12 ladies of indeterminate age. And although I don't think they have a conservation plan, the work that they do in conserving this property is extremely well done and extremely inexpensive, because it seems to revolve around getting their farmer mates to do it for nothing. So there are perhaps the most sustainable of our house museums work on the Keith model. Back to Experiment Farm Cottage. This is a photograph of the drawing room of the house as it was in 1963 from the Women's Weekly, the Australian Women's Weekly. And the project was extremely well managed by a group of very talented volunteers. Les Buckland, honorary architect, Mrs. Gregory Blaxland, later Dame Helen Blaxland, Ken Bernard-Smith and Kevin Fay, furniture experts. And it broke new ground in making the decision that the furnishing would focus on Australian colonial furniture. And it was immensely popular with the public. This small cottage had 16,000 visitors in its first year. What's the problem 50 years later? Well, I think part of the problem is, although community-based house museums have diversified, they have developed education programs, some have developed temporary exhibitions, the industry is seen as a one-product industry. It's like a restaurant which only serves one meal. And there's another problem as well. The way in which the meal is sometimes served, and I emphasise sometimes served, is not very good. And I can best describe this as a Ray Price moment, a country and western moment that I'm sure we've all experienced, where we've gone on the one dish house museum tour and the guide has felt that it is their role to tell us everything they know about the house. And the tour goes on and on and on, and we find ourselves internally singing that song, "Please release me, let me go." And to a degree, I think that is what the industry suffers from. It's seen as being like a restaurant which serves one dish only, and many people think that dish is not a good one. So it's not difficult to understand why visitation might be falling. Now, I think there are some solutions to the problem. And one place which I think is very inspiring is the Tenement Museum in New York, in the Lower East Side, Orchard Street, the Lower East Side. And when one reads about museums and different solutions, particularly if you're coming from the community sector, you sometimes look at what other people are doing successfully and you think, oh, well, it's all very well for them, you know, they're in Manhattan, they've got millions of dollars and they have all this expertise, but we can't do that. But yet, when you look at what the Tenement Museum does, it seems to me it is highly applicable to our community sector house museums. It's a block of flats, basically. It's 4 flats to each floor. I think there are about 16 in all. I suppose you could say it's the museum version of number 96. Now, it's extremely well researched, and instead of being a one-dish restaurant, they've created a whole lot of different dishes based on the detailed history of the occupants of those various flats. So they've got different experiences you can see here, shop life, sweatshop workers, hard times. And they market all these on the internet. And they charge a reasonable price. I think some of the tours are $22. So they're not underselling themselves. Whereas by and large, if you look at what we charge our visitors, we clearly don't think very much of our product. And putting this on the net, it's fantastic. It's getting people to make the decision right away, to give you the money. Doesn't matter if they don't turn up in a way once you've got the dosh. Then when you go into their ticket office, it's like McDonald's. There are all the products up there on the board, all the different things you can do. The tours are very well run, very interesting. And of course the logical thing is, having been to that restaurant and sampled one dish and seen that there are lots of other dishes, to taste more of them. Now, the platform with the Tenement Museum is this wonderful research from which one is able to develop all these different dishes. And yet, most of our museums, particularly the venerable ones that have been going for 40 or 50 years, do have a big platform of research. When we've worked on the buildings, we've learnt a lot about them. We've looked at the archaeology. We've gone to the archives. And the process of reinterpreting, which James alluded to, is one which usually results in an exponential increase in our understanding about the place and an exponential increase in the options we have for cooking different dishes. And I've just put up a quick slide of Grossman House, Maitland, where, as originally interpreted, the dining room was in the drawing room. It seems to be a bit of a theme with those recreated house museums of the 1960s to stick the dining room in the wrong room. See, it's got a white chimney piece. And the wallpaper was conjectural. And with some work done about 10 years ago, it was moved to the right room. Fragments of wallpaper were found and reproduced, etc. So a lot was learnt about that house at that time. Now I'm going to talk how one might put some of those ideas from the Tenement Museum into practice. How a place that doesn't have millions of dollars, that isn't in Manhattan, might do it. And I'm going to refer to Saumarez Homestead at Armidale. Armidale is a provincial city of 20,000 people up on the New England tableland, midway between Sydney and Brisbane, 500 kilometres north of Sydney, 500 kilometres south of Brisbane. And it's a pastoral property developed by the White family. We heard a bit about one of their other properties, Beltrees, in an earlier talk. And David Marr writes evocatively of the Whites when he says there was a river of gold that flowed up the Hunter, Beltrees is in the Hunter, up into the New England where Saumarez is. And the river of gold was, of course, all the money that came out of the pastoral industry in the 19th century. So the Whites were quite rich. And 2 generations of Whites lived on this property. They acquired it in the 1870s, and the last surviving member of the second generation, Elsie White, died in the early 1980s. When Elsie died, the shareholders in the White Pastoral Company decided to excise about 20 acres from their pastoral holdings, 20 acres which included all the most significant historic buildings, and to donate that to the National Trust. Unfortunately, it was not like Murrumang, where the McKinnons, as well as giving the buildings, gave an awful lot of land, which effectively provides an endowment. Saumarez does not have that benefit of rural land, which provides continuing income. It includes a 35-room homestead with an intact collection, designed by Pender, the same architect who designed Beltrees. Now, the property, I think, has been quite well run, largely by volunteers over the last 25 years. They have been sophisticated in that they have understood the value of leaving the property as an intact property, respecting its authenticity. They have resisted the temptation to redecorate. They have accepted shabbiness as part of the story. In the last couple of years, there has been an increase in energy, and the property has been much better promoted. There are 2 local papers in Armidale, and they've discovered that it's very easy to get free editorial. And so there's quite a regular flow of stories every month or so into those 2 papers. And it's not difficult to write such stories about historic properties. The photograph you can see there is of the Nobel laureate Patrick White, a cousin of the Somers Whites, and it's when he was 8 years old, dressed as the Mad Hatter at a ball in the Sydney Town Hall. One of the few photographs of Patrick White where he appears to be happy. This was discovered in the Somers collection. So it's very easy to find good stories. It's amazing the impact this has had on people in Armidale. Although the property's been open to the public for 25 years, people who never visited suddenly want to go there. They say, oh, things are really happening there. So it's not difficult, particularly for regional properties, to get publicity. Then one comes down to the question of... that must be Patrick White from the grave. Then you come down to how do you staff things? How do you get more volunteers? Well, we changed the way we did our recruitment. We used to get about 2 new volunteers a year, but we changed the way we recruit and we got 21 new volunteers this year. And there's a photograph of them. Why? Well, this is how we used to recruit. Somers Homestead is looking for more volunteers to assist in a variety of roles, including gardening, guiding, cafe catering, conservation marketing, cleaning, office, website, maintenance, carpentry, painting and bricklaying. And once you've done all that, you have to meet, greet and be useful as well. Not very attractive. So we've repitched that. And it's really about giving people something themselves as well as them giving back to us. Make an investment in your personal development and you assist your community by becoming a volunteer guide at Somers. Benefits include opportunities to share your knowledge, access to a stimulating program of continuing education, the chance to become a specialised guide working with groups, the satisfaction that you are playing an active part in conserving and interpreting Australia's heritage. So the pitch is twofold. It's about what you're getting, but also that you're giving. Now, product. We're not as good yet, by any means, as the Tenement Museum in New York, but we're on our way. We have a standard guided tour. We have specialised tours. You can do a backstairs tour with Molly the maid. And we decided we really had to get more money out of people. They weren't giving us enough. And so we developed a 2.5-day stay in Armidale, which is targeted at the over 50s Learning for Leisure market, particularly ADFAS, Australian Decorative and Fine Arts Society. And they receive a specialised lecture on furniture, a tour on furniture, a study of ceramics in the house. They get a talk on architects of Armidale, particularly our most famous architect, Horbury Hunt. They visit 2 Horbury Hunt buildings. They visit the Museum of Antiquity at the university. And they go to our local art museum and go through the racks and see the Conrad Martins picture that used to be at Somers before the Whites gave it to the local art museum. They receive 2 lunches and a morning and an afternoon tea. All this work is done by volunteers. They pay $95 a head, and the only cost, because it's volunteer delivered, the only cost is the food cost. So the profit margin is very high. We net about $2,000 a group, and the town, because they stay 2 nights, because they have evening meals, the town gets about $6,000, the motels and the restaurants. So it's good for us, but it's also good for our reputation. We are seen not as just some slightly irrelevant playhouse for a small group of people, but a place that really is putting into the local community. Now, how has that affected our bottom line? Because I do notice that money is mentioned in the subtitle of this conference. Well, this is the gross income. So we've gone from grossing somewhere around $60,000 a year to approaching $120,000 a year. Still not a lot of money when you look at the size of the estate, but still to double your gross income is pretty good. And if you look at all the depressing things that are being said about house museums. Nobody wants to visit them. They are not sustainable. It's very good. How does that affect our bottom line? Well, we're still losing money, but we're not losing as much as we were. And if you look at the last 2 years, we had declining income, increasing expenses, which is a recipe for bankruptcy, but now we've changed that. We've turned that around. So to look at what Tom said, we're on the first few steps, but we've got to keep on going. We haven't finished. Well, there's an excellent paper which I'd recommend to you, written by Kerry Carson, historian of historic Williamsburg, called Is There a Plan B? And one of the things Kerry talks about is feedback. He says now university lecturers, the students have some device where they can tell the lecturer while they're speaking whether they agree. Even apparently in the United States, clergymen in their sermons have these. Well, we haven't got devices like that. But maybe one way we can learn to cope with the Ray Price please release me syndrome is give our visitors placards, and when they're getting bored, they can wave it at the guide. They could, when they were losing interest, put up one saying, money, tell me about money. These are pretty fundamental themes to house museums. Tell me about lust. Tell me about power. Tell me about death. Of course, there are other things. Technology is our friend. In the digital age, the virtual and the real are handmaidens. At Parramatta Council got an Australian Tourism Development Grant in the last couple of years, $400,000, a rather comfortable amount of money, to develop an app which provided a guided tour of Parramatta. Now, the developers of the app, which was all about Governor Macquarie, it was for the Governor Macquarie Bicentenary, hence it's called the DigiMac. The developers of the app, although in Parramatta there's the house Macquarie lived in, which has been the subject of immense research and is a repository of great knowledge about him, the developers of the app seemed to think that house museums were terribly fuddy-duddy places and had no role to play in an app. And so when you do the app, it has some very unsatisfactory aspects. Old Government House was struck by lightning in 1820. And there's a marvellous account in a contemporary newspaper of the lightning striking the house, the bell wires melting, doors blowing off their hinges, the house being filled with sulphurous smoke, and Mrs. Macquarie and Lachlan Macquarie Jr. only surviving because they happened to be in the only room that wasn't affected. And this is dealt with in DigiMac. But instead of DigiMac taking you into the house where this actually happened and giving you all the drama of it, you hear about it about 300 metres away from the house. So really, the app, I think, is our friend, and we should be embracing it. And we have to fight back and say, well, house museums aren't fuddy-duddy. They aren't anti-technology. They are places with wonderful stories, and we welcome apps. And maybe what we have to do is go a step further. Instead of the app being created by an expert, this is the age where everybody wants to be the art producer. They don't want to have curators. They want to be curators themselves. And so in a property like Old Government House, where it's so well researched, we should perhaps be providing a library that is on the net and people can draw on. There can be things under different categories: first-person accounts, portraits, pictures of how this is a recreated house, how it used to look, what the sources are for the recreation. And we can encourage them to create their own app. We can even have an app competition and an award for the best app, and then get people to go out and try it. And I just want to give you an example of how that resource might work. This is Mrs. Macquarie, described by Lady Franklin as Governor of New South Wales for 10 years, so possibly it's her bicentenary that should be celebrated. This is the recreated dining room, which with James and his volunteers worked on. And this is an account. It actually, I have to admit this because James will pick me up, it's actually a description of a dinner at Government House, Sydney, with the Macquaries, but I'm going to exercise a bit of licence. This is a letter by Ellis Bent. We yesterday dined at Government House. At a farewell dinner given to Colonel and Mrs. Patterson, it was but stupid. Mrs. Macquarie has not the art of making people feel happy and comfortable around her. There were in all 17 persons present. Mrs. M's dinners are as much too small as the dinners usually served in the colony are too profuse. And then he goes on to describe what sounds to me like a fairly lavish meal. And there we have it in the Mitchell Library, portraits of some of the diners, Colonel Patterson, Ellis Bent in the middle, who wrote the letter, and Mrs. Patterson on the right. So we should be embracing the app, and we should be getting the younger generation. I can't remember if they're Generation X or Y, you'll have to tell me, but we should be getting them to go to our resource library online and create their own apps. Now, Kerry Carson refers to Second Life. Hands up anybody who's ventured into Second Life. Well, we've got a couple of people. And he says this is a tool for historic house museums. I haven't been in Second Life myself, but I did have a look, and I noticed it's actually morphed into something called Real Life. So it's already actually out there. And we should be picking that up as well, as a way of creating the context of our historic places. Now, I'm going to bring you back to something a bit more grounded. Our historic houses are great repositories of how you look after historic buildings, because we've had to cope with all those things. We've had to remove the cement renders. We've had to put in the damp courses. We've had to fix the roof. We've had to clean the gutters. We have all that know-how about looking after historic properties, but we don't tell anybody about it. We keep it a secret. I know here in South Australia you discuss salt dab every night over dinner, and so this doesn't apply to you. But in the East, if you were to go to Bunnings and you were to say to them, I've got dab in my house, what should I do about it? They would pull off the shelf a product to seal the dab in, something like Bondcrete, and they'd say, oh, you apply this and that'll fix it, which we've known for 40 years is the wrong thing to do. It just exacerbates it. But we're not telling the public. Why haven't we got little YouTube videos which use the work we've done at our properties as case studies for the home improvement market, the way SPAB does? Go into the website and you'll see they have all sorts of good little films. So really, we're not marketing our resource. Lastly, we have to be bold. And Priscilla, can you, how do I pronounce? Thank you very much. I was recently in New Zealand a few weeks ago, and I went to the house, the name of which Priscilla just mentioned, up in the Bay of Islands. And when I was going through, I was amazed to find the Reverend William Yate had been there. William Yate, I'd first come across him 20 years ago when I was reading the Reverend Richard Taylor's diary of Liverpool, Sydney, and he referred to the scandal of the Reverend William Yate without going into any details. And the problem really was that the missionary Yate, when he went to the Bay of Islands to convert the Maoris, he took the gospel message about love too literally. Here's his study. And his story is present in the house, as you will see from this label. The Reverend William Yate was resident clergyman at the mission station from 1831 until his departure in 1834 for England, where he published his rather unreliable account of New Zealand. He was dismissed by Samuel Marsden for alleged misconduct in Sydney in 1836 and never returned to New Zealand. When the news was received by his former colleagues, they burned his belongings and shot his horse. A summary view and explanation of the writings of the prophets appears to have been one book to escape the purifying bonfire. Perhaps whoever was then in possession of it thought that ripping out the bookplate would be sufficient. Enough remains for there to be no doubt about the book's original owner. And there we have the book. Now, I think Yates' story is a fascinating and topical one, and it's the kind of story that can change people's perception that historic house museums are fuddy-duddy, irrelevant places where people tell you everything they know about the place and far more than you want to hear in one sitting. So we have no reason to be depressed. We have great opportunities. We have the asset of the tangible, the building, the landscape, the collections. We have the great asset of all that research and knowledge we have, and that really is where we will get pay dirt. We have the creativity to turn that into a range of satisfying dishes, so we're no longer just a one-meal restaurant. And in the community sector, where there is so little money, we have the potential to recruit a great team of volunteers. And really, we are at the second wave in this age where people are living longer, are fitter, better educated, have more money, and in retirement, they want to be out achieving something. We are really on the cusp of the second great age of volunteering. So for our community museums, the challenge is there. Where do you start? Well, get the volunteers on board. Like Mao, let 1,000 flowers bloom. Thank you very much.